And the one who is not here is Guru Hansen-Helskog. She has an emergency situation in her family and can't unfortunately join the panel. My name is Michael Weiss, and before I start with a short introduction, I would like to give you a brief overview of what we are going to do within the next 1.5 or 2 hours. First, a short introduction from my side into the topic. After that, the panel members will present some of their work and themselves. And then we go into an open dialogue. I brought some questions with me that I would like to pose, and then we can investigate these questions together. First, only the panel members, but then after a while, I would also like to invite all the others from the audience to join in and pose questions, come with ideas, and so on. So this is the plan for the next 1.5, 2 hours. Before I would like to introduce you to the topic of philosophical practice and research, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference, especially Sergey, for doing this once again, just like last year. It's a really great event, great organization, great preparation, and you did and still do a really fine and great job. Thank you very much. I enjoy being here. Good. The topic of philosophical practice and research, it might sound a bit contradicting because research is very often something that you would attribute. Regina, you don't have to show that now. You can actually stop the sharing of the screen. I will tell you later when to start with the presentation. Okay, great. The topic might sound a bit contradicting because philosophical practice is something that we assume has to do with practice, and research is often something that we assume is connected and attributed to academia, university, and so on, and more theoretical maybe. Anders, you wrote in the foreword to the Socratic Handbook that at the first conference in Vancouver, there were many people who thought that they could and want to renew philosophy by bringing philosophy from the ivory tower of academia back to the market square. But there were also some people at the conference who thought that renewing philosophy from within university or from within academia is also necessary and an important step. In fact, when you have a look at the development, so we can find that already since the early days of philosophical practice, where much happened outside academia, there was still always some kind of research, empirical research within the field. In the beginning, you can say in the first almost 2 decades, there were case studies. That was the research that was done within our field. However, the question was, of course, as Peter Raby criticized in his book in 2000 called Philosophical Counseling, he criticized that all these case studies that were presented so far were nothing else than an attempt to give proof of one's own approach. So all the practitioners were writing about their cases, presenting their cases, and by that trying to defend and support their own approaches. Whether we share this criticism or not is another question, but what we can say is that the methodology in these early days was mainly observation. Sometimes some practitioners also used questionnaires, but observation was the main methodological approach. In 2017, Pepe, you were, as far as I know, the first one who initiated and ran a quantitative study on philosophical practice. I remember we were 4 participants from 4 different countries carrying out the practice, but then also gathering the data with the so-called 3-dimensional wisdom scale test. The results were very interesting. Along that this was the first quantitative study and not qualitative study was a new thing, but also the fact that you used the wisdom scale test for that showed in which direction this can go. It was not any psychological tests that were run. It was a wisdom test, assuming, or that was the hypothesis of you as I understood it or understand it, that philosophical practice is a practice that promotes or supports or is oriented towards wisdom or wisdom development. What we can say about that so far, both qualitative case studies, quantitative research, that there was several projects going on. Well, you could say this is research on philosophical practice. What are the outcomes of philosophical practice? Maybe even the effects and so on. But here we could ask, well, we as practitioners who are carrying out the practice or the practice part, are we also qualified to carry out the research part? Are we qualified to do research as practitioners? And why do we need that? Do we have to justify what we do within our field? Or does research give us a better insight and understanding of what we are actually doing? And here we go over from research on philosophical practice to research for philosophical practice. Where we can ask, is research supporting our cause? Is research a supportive feature that relieves us from the pressure of being a poor copy of psychotherapy, for example, and an independent discipline? And Donata, maybe you can tell us a bit later. You are the organizer and leader of the first and only academic program in the German-speaking countries on philosophical practice at the University of Vienna. Maybe you can tell us a bit about that later, whether research informs the teaching in that program. And then finally, when we go over from research for philosophical practice to research with philosophical practice, Anush, you developed your own approach, which is called reflective practice research, which is not an approach to do research on philosophical practice, but a research approach based on philosophical practice. And I really hope that you can tell us a bit more about that later, also in the brief presentation. Guido and me have used that approach in several projects now. We're colleagues at the University of Southeastern Norway, where we mainly do research with and for and on philosophical practice by means of reflective practice research. I don't want to say about that too much, but we now go over to the short presentations of each panel member. I would like to start with you, Pepe, to tell us a bit about your work, yourself. As you said previously, before we started, you have 6 to 8 minutes. Just go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. I'm going to share my screen. I hope you can see now my screen. Okay. Can you see my screen now? Some mistake in researching in philosophical practice now?
Yes.
Yeah, we can.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Michael, for making again a panel on research and philosophical practice, because I think that it is very important to this panel, and we started in 2018 in Mexico with a panel on research on philosophical practice, and I think that it is very important here to know what is this one. What am I going to present in 8 minutes? First of all, I am going to explain briefly our 2 main empirical projects, the project that Michael talked, Wisdom Philosophical Practice Project. After that, the Boesio project, and I am going to finish with some mistakes in researching in philosophical practice. As Michael said, in 2015, I started to design a empirical project on philosophical practice and wisdom. The question was, is it possible that to work with philosophical practice can enlarge, can improve wisdom? And as he said, we work mainly with the Money-Cardell test, and that test work on cognitive, reflective, and affective aspect. Here you can see the Spanish team, but as Michael said, it was a team in 4 countries, in Mexico, There was David Sumiacher, the coordinator was David Sumiacher. Michael Noah Weiss was in Norway, in BN2, in Switzerland. Soren Koisik in Bulgaria, and Gudrun Hansen was working with Michael Weiss. And we had a person that was a specialist in empirical issues, and it was funded by the University of Chicago and the John Templeton Foundation. We had some results. I am not going to talk about it, but here you can see that the people who work with philosophical practice improve their abilities, mainly in affective and cognitive points. After that, we started a project on imprisoned, that is Boecio. We have a panel on this project, and the idea was the same, more or less. Can we make an empirical research in several countries, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, Argentina, Spain, in order to know if philosophical practice have any improvement in people? We have the opportunity to be funded. Well, we are being funded by the European Union and by the Cooperation for Development Office in my university. And our goal was to prove the efficacy of philosophical workshops by a rigorous empirical procedure that reached more than 500 inmates. The instrument we developed, we used were the Ardell test, the Webster test, and we add some qualitative instrument like a focus group and interviews about some events. And we have we don't have all the results or all the outcomes for the moment because it's an ongoing project, but we have some results that I am going to explain in the other panel. Some quantitative and some qualitative results. Some mistakes in general in 5 minutes that we have in our research in philosophical practice. First of all, researchers don't know how to develop a good design. They don't know what is a design, an empirical design in philosophical practice. Second, researchers don't know what are the methods, the quantitative and qualitative methods in the research, and therefore they don't reflect on why to use a quantitative or a qualitative method. If it is better to use interviews, for example, or focus group or ethnography method. If we are going to make interviews, what kind of interviews are we going to do? For example, life stories. Are we going to use interviews to get just some information? Or what is the justification, the reason to choose one method or the other method? In addition, researchers normally weren't trained to carry out an interview. It's not easy to make an interview. You need a special training in order to develop this interview if you are trying to make a rigorous study. Results in general are not generalized in a good way, mainly when you make qualitative studies or when you make case studies. There is a different generalization in quantitative and qualitative studies, and the triangulation is not carried out or is not carried out rightly. In quantitative studies, there are no, in quantitative studies, normally there are not control group, there are not validated tests. Tests are applied to wrong groups. Why? Because each test is devoted to a specific profile of participant, and in some occasions, the participants are not good for that test. The recruitment is wrong or it doesn't exist. There aren't an ethical program in the design. The results are not properly analyzed. And in general, researchers don't know qualitative methods. In qualitative research, 2 minutes, the problem could be that the interviews weren't transcribed or the transcription is wrong because researchers don't know differences between several types of transcription, for example, Jefferson or another kind of transcription. Researchers don't know how to develop each methodology. For example, case studies are different to interviews. They are a different methodology. Or results are not generalized in a good way because it is different to make a generalization in quantitative and qualitative studies. The reason, I'm going to finish it, normally we don't have, or we have a lack of knowledge or training of these methods in philosophy. There isn't a formal or academic evaluation of the empirical projects in philosophical practice. Why? Because normally they are not funded by external institution. When you need external financiation, there is specialists and academic people that are going to decide what project is going to be funded, and you need to propose a very rigorous project. And the results normally are presented to an audience without knowledge of these methodologies. If we present these projects in some conference with people that are trained in these methods, normally they would say that there is a problem. So here I have opened the idea of some mistakes in researching in philosophical practice, but I want to say, to finish, that this is just one way to research in philosophical practice and in philosophy, but I think that in philosophy we have another kind of research, like hermeneutics, phenomenological, and the like. And of course, I work with those methodologies too, and I think that it is very important that we work on it, even though here we are talking about another kind of researching, I suppose so. So this is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pepe. That was a wonderful insight into your work. I would like to go over to you, Donata, and ask you to give us a short and brief presentation of you and your work.
Okay. So for the people who don't know me, I'm Donata Romizzi, and I work at the University of Vienna. I have a background in philosophy of science. This is of some advantage to think about methods for research, but at some point I got interested in philosophical practice. I did my training with Gerd Achenbach, and then I've initiated a postgraduate program on philosophical practice at the University of Vienna, which is running since 2014. And I think through philosophical practice, philosophical practice revived my interest in education. So I shift my focus, research focus, away from philosophy of science towards philosophy and education. So now I have a tenure-track professorship for philosophy and its didactics. Here, I just want to tell you about a project I have submitted. So I am not already carrying out the project. I'm really at the beginning. It's a project, a research project about philosophical practice and ancient philosophy. So I think it belongs not so much to the category research on philosophical practice, because here I would be very insecure, in fact, about how to pursue such research. But I would say it belongs to the category research for philosophical practice. So I have I have a good chance to, I had a good chance to initiate this project because I have a colleague and a very good friend of mine, Angelo Giavato, whom you see on this slide, who is a philologist and has a chair for ancient philosophy at the University of Nantes in France. And we have been talking about philosophical practice and ancient philosophy for many years because he's very open. He even tried some methods of philosophical practice, for example, the companionship method by Ran Lahav in his teaching about ancient philosophy. And at some point, we thought, why not pursuing a project together? So we have now submitted this project, Leaving Antiquity, Philosophical Practice and Ancient Philosophy. For funding, we still have no answer, so it's an open ongoing thing. We can go to the second slide, please. So the project is an international project, a collaboration between two national funding institutions, the French one and the Austrian one. The main aims are, the first aim is about the potential of ancient philosophy for philosophical practice. So the aim is to revise and enrich the use of methods and contents from ancient philosophy for philosophical practice. And I will say a couple of words about this later. Then it's about the potential of philosophical practice for scholars of ancient philosophy. We want to stimulate scholars of ancient philosophy to try a different approach to their primary sources, especially in the context of teaching, inspired by philosophical practice. And the third aim is to use the contents and methods we would develop in this project if it got funded, to use the content methods and materials for any other context or any possible, not only specifically academic philosophical context of education or self-formation. Of course, we cannot deal with the entire ancient philosophy, so our main foci are Plato, the Socratic dialogues, and Stoicism. We can go to the last slide. So one could ask, okay, don't we know already enough about ancient philosophy for philosophical practice? I think everybody knows Pierre Hadot and the Hellenistic philosophy and Socratic dialogue, and one could think, okay, don't we have enough? I don't have the feeling that we have enough, and I don't have the feeling that our practices always rely on very solid knowledge about what we are talking about. For example, what is a Socratic dialogue? This is an open issue in research in ancient philosophy. What is really at stake in such a dialogue? What is the purpose of this kind of dialogue? What is its philosophical background? Its assumptions. I think that we could know much more about these topics. And regarding Stoicism, it would be important for me. Stoicism is very common knowledge in philosophical practice, but I have the impression that it's often focused on the doctrine in a sense of like a given wisdom, to try to act and be like the Stoics. There is such movements like Stoicism today and so on. But this goes, in my opinion, often very much in the direction of the psychological benefits of developing such an attitude. And I would like to shift the focus a bit on something which would be, to my mind, more philosophical, and that is namely the methodology of the Stoics, how they dealt with philosophical problems. There is a lot to learn, also in the sense of logic and epistemology, which were very fundamental for the Stoics, for the ethics. So, and my last point is a question one may ask. Why should we care about a better understanding of ancient philosophy? One could say, well, history of philosophy is not the main interest for philosophical practitioners. What is so wrong in taking some characters, some traits of Socratic dialogue and just call it Socratic dialogues? And as long as it works, who cares about about what really Plato wanted to do with the Socratic dialogue? Well, here I would say very shortly two things. I think that philosophical practice has, of course, very much to do with dialogue with living people, but I think it has also much to do with a dialogue with dead people, I mean dead philosophers, and with text. And I think that we should have towards dead philosophers and texts the same attitude as with people. To do some, I think we should do an hermeneutical effort to try to understand what they really mean, and not instrumentalize or to say what is this said, or interpret things into what is said, just to use it for our tasks. So I think that also in the dialogue with text and dead philosopher, we should cultivate a kind of respect and genuine interest for what the other really has to say without projecting our needs and opinions on this. So I think also in the dialogue with the philosophical tradition, it's very important to this effort to try to really understand the other, even if we have the great disadvantage that the other cannot reply. And the other point is that I think that a solid knowledge in philosophical tradition about the philosophical tradition is very important for philosophical practice. There is this long debated question about what makes philosophical practice philosophical, which of course presupposes an answer to the question what philosophy is. And I think that it's difficult to find an answer about what philosophy is without referring to the philosophical tradition. I think that it's very difficult to find answers somewhere else without being just a bit arbitrary, subjective in deciding what philosophy is. So, and this is a reason why it's important to my mind to improve the knowledge of the philosophical tradition, and I think that this would be research for philosophical practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Donata. A very interesting presentation too, because it shows, when we think back to the presentation of paper, it already shows the wide spectrum of what is possible within research on or for philosophical practice. I would like to give the word now to Anna Schlinzet, Professor Emeritus at Nord University. Anush is one of those probably who were not only working with philosophical practice and research on or for philosophical practice, but you developed an approach called reflective practice research, which is research with philosophical practice. Anush, you are a pioneer in the field, especially in Scandinavia, but you were also working as professor in several other fields. You have a lot of experience when it comes to research and all its pitfalls. I would like to give the word to you, and I'm curious about what you have to say on the topic.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you also for your presentation. So I don't need to go so much into that. I have, I would start to say that the philosophical practice, as I understand it, is in itself a kind of investigation. It is not something you do that you solely could understand instrumentally as an activity that has effects. It is that also. So I find it interesting with this quantitative approach. But if you regard philosophical practice as a kind of investigation that the philosopher do together with the guest in his or her practice, it has to be a kind of qualitative approach that you have. I have written a paper on research, you could say, or on this investigation aspect of philosophical practice. And the title of the paper is the meaningfulness of and satisfaction from dialogues in philosophical practice, considerations of content and methodology. And that paper has been published in Cambridge Scholars Publishing in 2015. The editors were Alexander Fatic and Lydia Amir, and the book has the title Practicing Philosophy. Practicing Philosophy. So there I have chapter 3 in that book. My starting point in this paper is that I think it's an experience that we all do when we are philosophical practitioners and also guests in the practices. That an experience that we all do is that dialogues in philosophical practice are experienced as meaningful and satisfying. So how to investigate this experience of meaningfulness and satisfaction? So when I write the paper, I make clear that my approach is not quantitative. So I am, if you have a quantitative approach, you could start by raising the question: is it really the case that the dialogues are satisfying? And how much is that the case? And what does satisfying mean? And what do the dialogues in philosophical practice lead to? And how can you test what they lead to? And so on. I think you have heard about that from Pepe and from Donata a little also. So you could say the approach I have is rather how this meaningfulness and satisfaction is to be understood. How is the meaningfulness of and satisfaction from dialogues in the philosophical practice to be understood? And that, of course, requires a phenomenological, or you could say a phenomenological hermeneutical research method. So now I will not use so much time in talking about phenomenological hermeneutical research methods, but I would like to describe what you, Michael, mentioned, that I have been not alone, but I think I was the person who had the idea of the naming of this method, what is called reflective practice research, or you could say reflective practice near research. And that is a kind of research where those practicing themselves research what they are into. They reflect on their participation in practice. So to make it very short, also this reflective practice research methodology is presented in 3 steps. First comes what is called primary or concrete reflection. That means, I think you could say, you can, of course, in philosophical practice, as I started to say, it is an kind of investigation from the beginning. So you could, of course, ask yourself all the way in the philosophical practice what the satisfying is. But you could also, when you have experienced philosophical practice for some time, you could decide to do a research on your experience and to look back a little. What have I been into in this philosophical practice? What was important to me? So, and that is something that the guests in the practice and also the philosopher could do, to ask himself, to ask herself, what was especially satisfying? And then ask oneself, what comes to my mind when I say that? Also, yeah, it was satisfying, but what was really satisfying? And then you could start. The first step is then to tell, to narrate, to tell, to express in a narration what the satisfying was. Then you have to be concrete, because you know somehow, yeah, that was satisfying, but what was satisfying? So the first step is to tell the story about this experience of satisfaction. Then you have to be concrete to tell the story. When I call it concrete reflection, that is something that Paul Ricoeur in his methodology mentions. And so he has this idea that you have to first, when you investigate your own experience, to tell what it was about. You have to make it concrete, and that is, so to speak, the starting point. You know intuitively, yeah, it was satisfying, but how was it satisfying? What was that about? Then you have to tell it to make it concrete, that it is viewable, so to speak. And that is the first level of reflection. That is a level of reflection where you produce a story that you afterwards can reflect on. This first initial primary reflection is rather a reflection where a narrative is created that you afterwards can reflect on. But it is a reflective process, because when you tell, you realize, oh yeah, that was what it was about, but when I tell it like this, maybe I should tell it a little otherwise, because something that was important to me in this experience does not really come out when I say it like this. So then you have to tell it again, and maybe again and again, and afterwards and in the end you don't come to a perfect narrative. So you could say, oh no, I have got it all, but you say then, well, this is good enough. I have now expressed, I think I made visible what was so satisfactory for me. And then the second step I call critical reflection, and that is when you sit, you lean a little back and look at your narrative that you have produced in the first step, and then you ask yourself, what is this really about? When I say it is about what is satisfactory in philosophical practice, what is that about? And then you try to express in your own words what that is about. And the third step I call theoretical reflection. And the theoretical reflection is to connect the topics that you have found through your critical reflection and through the initial primary reflection, to connect these topics with philosophical thinking. And I can just mention several such topics or such dialogues you can have with the philosophical tradition, with philosophical texts. For instance, one topic is, what does it mean to understand the person? You, as philosophical practitioner, you try to understand what your guest is saying, but do you try to understand your guest? That is a little difficult question, and a little. And what about the guests? Do they feel understood? And what is that about? And then, for instance, when I raise this question, I connect to text by Hans-Georg Gadamer, where Gadamer says you can't understand another human being. You can only understand what other human beings express through words or deeds. Another topic you could go into is this concept of dialogue. What is the essence of dialogue? Because you, in your philosophical practice, you are experiencing that, what dialogues are about, and what is so important in dialogue, and so on and so on. Another topic is what I call relational ethics. What is ethics about? That's a big topic, of course. You could also focus on what you could call the moralism of morals. That is a topic that, for instance, Nietzsche goes into when he points at an experience that I think we all do if we are honest enough to see it, to recognize it, is that the morals we are participating in are very often very moralistic. That means they are not so much moral that should be useful for us human beings, but it turns around difficult in the opposite direction. We as human beings should be useful for the morals. Then you have moralism. And that is something, when you read Nietzsche, he has a very, very good view on this danger of moralism, of morals.
Anders,
I'm finished.
I don't want to moralize now, but we have to take care of the time.
Yeah, I am finished in 1 minute.
You now.
I hope I used more time than I should. I'm finished.
Yes.
I'm finished now practically. But I just want to mention also the topic of learning from crisis. That is a big topic going back to Plato. Life phenomena, what are life phenomena really about? And I'm developed some kind of, I think I could call it the Neoplatonist perspective on ideas as narratives. Okay, that was just to give some that you have the feeling, oh, that could be interesting.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much so far.
Thank you very much, Anders. I think that you gave us a good insight and idea of what you mean step by step with reflective practice research. I would like to give some other examples how Guru and me use this approach in a couple of our projects. If you, Regina, if you could go to the second slide, then I would just briefly present a couple of projects we did, research projects, and then we go over into the discussion. The first project are the so-called daimonic dialogues. That was a project that I did 2 years ago at a Norwegian folk high school. Those of you who come from Scandinavia know what a folk high school is. For the others, I just want to mention briefly, these are schools, 1-year boarding schools with no exams. You don't get any grades. It's just a learning for its own sake. You do, for example, a film class, sports class, whatever, painting class, just because you want to learn painting or enjoy that activity. Their main goal or overall goal of these schools is what in German is called Bildung in its original sense. In English, maybe best translated with self-formation. And what I did there was 7 philosophical guided imageries with 15 students who were between 19 and 21 years old over a period of 2 months. And then I evaluated what is this practice of philosophical guided imageries, what is it actually doing to the students? And what I have to say here when I say philosophical guided imageries, these were imageries where you, for example, visited in your imagination the Temple of Delphi and the Delphic oracle there, and you saw the inscription of Know Thyself and so on. Or when the topic was the art of living, you visited an exhibition and you found a piece of art and you tried to relate that piece of art to the overall topic of the art of living. So in this way, the students investigated different philosophical key topics. And the research question was, can the practice of philosophical guided imageries foster self-formation? And there were a couple of, how should I say, trends or general aspects of the human condition that came to the fore that were fostered or developed. The first one was that the students in general got more calm and less stressed, also in their everyday life. There was a certain form of existential learning. For example, how could they learn to deal with certain challenging situations in their lives? How could they learn more about responsibility and so on? And the third trend was gaining self-knowledge. As you can see here in the three quotes, one of these students said, after we finished the project, I have learned a lot about myself during this project and it helped me to become a better version of myself. Then another student stated that I got many new experiences and knowledge about myself, which I was not aware of. And the last one said, I see personal growth and how to go deeper into myself. So this was the direction that into which the whole thing was going. And I just wanted to figure out what is this practice of philosophical guided imageries? What is it actually doing, so that I also know as practitioner what am I actually doing there, to get a better understanding of my own practice. If we hop over to the third slide, Regina. Thank you. Then you see a couple of publications here. They represent research projects that I did partly with Guru Hansen Helskog. The first two publications are about a project where we trained teachers and students in certain philosophical practices. And they were about mainly what is called life skills and democratic citizenship, or you could also call it the art of living. Life skills is just a more modern term for the art of living. And what I have to mention is that life skills and also democratic citizenship, as well as sustainable development, there are three key topics in the national curricula in Norway. And not only all the schools, but all the subjects are obliged to foster these three key aspects. So we try to see what can philosophical practice do in order to promote these key aspects. Because basically there are not many approaches. They just came and implemented that in the national curriculum, but nobody really knew how to develop or foster these key aspects. Yes, the third one was then about sustainable development. What I can say here about these first three articles is that a big issue is in these research projects, or in a philosophical practice approach in general, is that if people don't participate voluntarily, it won't work. And you probably already know that, but sometimes when you do this at schools, it's probably the head of the school who says, no, I force my teachers to participate in the project because I'm convinced that this is important. And then you have about 20 teachers in there who say, hey, I really don't know what to do here because actually it's my spare time and now I was forced to be here and do something that I'm not interested in. And that, of course, has an effect on the results of the research too. So you have to figure out what are you actually doing there and with whom are you doing that. Because if it's people who are doing that voluntarily, the outcome is, of course, a different one than if you're doing that with people, if you're philosophizing with people who don't want to do that. That's pretty clear, but it was interesting to do research on that and how it influences the whole research approach and the outcome, of course, too. The last two projects were about reflective practice. Projects where we highly criticized what was going on in teacher education today, because it's a really streamlined approach to produce teachers, to call it like that. And we wanted to investigate by a philosophical approach what is actually the problem there. Like free thinking, this is not what is wanted of the teacher of today anymore. And how can we get that to, how can we put a name on that? And we used actually a name for that. We borrowed it from one of our colleagues, Finn Torbjørn Hansen, and that is the term the Eichmannization of education. And so this is one of the key topics that we came forward in that research. But now enough about that. I think that you have an impression of the wide spectrum of what you can do, with philosophical practice and research. I would like to use the rest of the time. We still have more than 1 hour for an open dialogue and discussion. You have seen that there are many different approaches to this topic, to research and philosophical practice. Nevertheless, as I mentioned in the beginning, in the introduction, some of you maybe wonder whether philosophical practice and research aren't a contradiction, because the intention, the initial intention of philosophical practice was to get out of the ivory tower of academia, back to the market square, to philosophize with people again. And the question then is, isn't research an approach and an activity which is something that is going on inside academia, which is an activity that is kind of limited or within certain boundaries? It's within a very strict framework where you have where you have certain rules, what is allowed and what is not allowed. And the question is, aren't the two more a contradiction than a good combination? So this is my first question to you, panel members. What do you think? Is philosophical practice and research more of a contradiction, or can they embrace each other?
Maybe I could start just to say
please.
that I think that this topic of research is exactly what we need to connect philosophical practice outside academia and philosophical practice as a topic for academia. And the reason for that is very simple. It's because when we do philosophical practice also outside academia, it has this investigative nature. We try to find out something. We try to understand ourselves better. What is our problems about? What is life about? And that is, of course, also a topic for philosophy inside the universities. So I think that is exactly the connection point between philosophical practice for the people and philosophical practice for the professors, to say it like that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Anders, because you pointed out a very interesting aspect here, because you say basically that philosophical practice is a form of investigation and therefore also a form of research. What do the other two, Donata and Pepe, think about that?
I think that the research on philosophical practice should be inside and outside of academia. I agree with Anders that we have to develop our research based on experience. In fact, this is the main topic of my research, life experience. And in order, more than experimental philosophy, and in order to develop a research based on experience, it could be very interesting to make it outside of the academia, maybe, but we need some academic knowledge, for example, Gadamer, but Buber, for example, Levinas, all the people who have worked on an encounter, on putting in contact people. So I think it is very interesting. But second, why inside academia too? If you propose a research inside academia in philosophy, you have two kinds of research. First one is basic research, and the second one is applied research. You can develop some research just to enlarge the knowledge and not to make nothing for the society. And that research, I think that it is very important, and we don't need to have some practical result. It is true, and I am going to finish, that more and more the academic research are requiring practical and social results or result for the society. I am assessing. I am a European evaluator of projects, and there is now one question that the candidates have to answer, and is how are you going to apply to your research to society? But normally there is at least in Spain, there is basic research, and you don't have to answer how you are going to apply that research to society. So for me, inside and outside academy.
Thank you very much. That was an enlightening point you made here. Donato, you probably also want to say something about that.
Well, a lot of stuff has been mentioned. I think that, well, starting back with Anders' point, I also think that philosophical investigation, in the sense of philosophical practice shares character of investigation with academic and scientific research. First, I mean, on both sides mentioned by Pepe, it shares a theoretical interest typical of non-applied research, which is, in my view, very important to keep the boundary between philosophical practice and psychology. I mean, this idea that we can pursue a philosophical investigation in dialogue without necessarily have a purpose of utility in terms of the person has to feel better or something like this. So it's important, this kind of disinterested interest in this striving for understanding and find some truth independently from the utility for the subject, and this is something philosophical practice can share with a pure theoretical interest typical of academic research. But of course, it can also share, especially if we relate philosophical. If we have a pragmatic approach to philosophical practice, then of course philosophical investigation share also a practical purpose. But there is also a tension, I would say, because Michael, your original question was, are they a contradiction? And I see some points of tension, at least. And one point seems to me that academic research, like written philosophy, has a desire to fix things, to systematize, to clear, and to produce results. And and it bears on very strong assumptions. If you want to do research on philosophical practice, for example, you have to decide what are we searching for and what is the criterion. So are we searching? Are we doing an investigation to find out if whether philosophical practice is effective in solving problems? You know, you have to find a criterion. You have to find, for example, if you talk about wisdom scale, you have to decide what wisdom is. If you say, I want to find out if dialogue is satisfying, it seems to presuppose that this is a good thing for a dialogue. A good dialogue is a satisfying dialogue. Huh? So you have very strong presuppositions, and you can do your research, and this is very interesting. But in an open dialogical culture, philosophical culture, like the one which is characteristic of philosophical practice, you have also then to cast doubt on assumptions. You have to have this freedom again and not fix it, but ask again, okay, is a dialogue good when is it satisfying, or what is wisdom? And then in a dialogical way, you reopen it reminds me a bit of this kind of criticism some philosophers had towards written philosophy. When you write, you make assumptions, you fix it, but the dialogue has the advantage that you can reopen, which is of course very, very essential for philosophy, that you can cast doubt again on things that you have assumed. And I think this is very, very important.
Thank you, Donata. If I summarize your three statements, then it was Anush, when asking about whether philosophical practice and research are contradicting each other, Anush meant, no, it's the contrary. Philosophical practice is a form of investigation and therefore research. Pepe, you mentioned then, well, yes, but we also have to be aware of that when we do research, there is basic research and applied research. And then you, Donato, brought up some interesting points. Just to use some of your words that stuck with me, and that was to fix something, to produce something. And often, I agree with you, in research, it's exactly about that, to produce something, to fix something, to solve something. And here, maybe we have to be a bit careful, or when I refer to what you were saying, to reflect on your practice as a practitioner, whether as a nurse, whether as a physician, as a philosopher, that is not necessarily new. We know that from the field of action research, to reflect and investigate action. But in action research, it's very often about solving a problem. With a certain practice, we have a problem. It doesn't lead to the expected or desired outcomes, so we have to investigate that action or that practice, and then we fix it. And here, that approach refers to what Aristotle called techne, technical knowledge, know-how knowledge. Whereas when we see at this philosophical approach that we discussed here, it points more in the direction of phronesis, practical knowledge in terms of practical wisdom, to better understand what we are doing, not necessarily in terms of to have a know-how, how to reproduce a certain practice, but more in the sense of to become aware of what is actually going on in that practice while doing it, what is going on with us. And here, I think I agree with Anush, the knowledge produced and science and research is very often about the production of knowledge or the development of knowledge. I don't like the term production, but I think if we go so far to say that philosophical practice is a form of research, then the knowledge, let's say, developed points more into the direction of phronesis, practical wisdom. That is an assumption, as you said, Donata. So that's open to discussion. What is the kind of knowledge that we produce when doing research on or for or with philosophical practice? What do you think? You can choose, the three of you. Who wants to begin?
Okay, I am going to try to begin, not to begin, to try to begin. First of all, I think that philosophy in general, not philosophical practice, philosophy in general, not just produce knowledge, it destroys knowledge. And if you read, for example, Michel Foucault, he decided that be careful with producing knowledge, not because the knowledge, but because the aim to produce something. For me, producing is not bad, but the problem is what is the king you are serving? I mean, what is the people you are giving that knowledge? For example, you can produce some knowledge, I don't know, maybe to make people more deep, and for me it's good. But if you produce that knowledge and you don't know who is the king, the owner of that knowledge, this is a problem. And here, if you read Max Horkheimer or Theodor Adorno, you know that here you have an instrumental reason. against a critical reason. Therefore, what kind of knowledge do we have to produce? I don't know if I would use that word. Anyway, what kind of knowledge do we have to produce? I think that we have to help people to produce critical knowledge. And this is that we have to criticize all the knowledge that people make. And second, we have to produce, we don't have to produce knowledge. We have to help people to produce their own knowledge. It's different. I am not just going to be the theoretical author that have all the answers. I am going to be a partner, a partner of people in order they produce their own knowledge. And this is, I think that it could be very different. And philosophical practice is someone who don't try to produce all the knowledge. It's one who try to help people to produce the knowledge of the other people. And I think that this is very important because it is a principle of humility. I am not the boss. I am going to facilitate some skills and some tools for people create their own knowledge. I'm trying to just try to answer the question.
Thank you very much, Pepe. Anders, you want to continue?
Yeah, I would just like to mention an example because I'm just writing about that very shortly. To mention an example, I once had, as I was in Tromsø at the University of Tromsø in northern Norway, I had a young female physician from the hospital who was suffering from her practice. She told that she was very uncertain, and especially in life-saving situations, she didn't know what to do, and so on. And then, of course, just to try to make the point very shortly. So she had the feeling she should know what to do, but she didn't have the necessary knowledge yet. She was too young, she was inexperienced. And when she was working and there was a critical situation and she didn't know what to do, she tried to contact the more experienced physician who was home and on telephone, but then she couldn't reach the guy, and she had to decide herself, and she felt very bad about that. And if things would go wrong, she could be criticized from the family of the patient that maybe died, or she could also be it could be written about it in the newspapers, in fact. And that is something that happens, of course. So then the point is just that also what was good for her and what was that had an impact on her practice, you could say, was just to understand that it was nothing wrong with her that she felt so insecure. It is rather a problem if physicians in the hospital don't feel insecure, because you cannot know for sure if you can save a life. Also, in a critical situation, sometimes you save a life, in other times it doesn't really function. You maybe get the person back to life, but she is not really living in a good way and dying in a couple of months and so on. And I could tell her I have been a part of doing research on these topics where the nurses very often say the physicians don't let the patients die in what do you say, verity? What is that in English? Worthy, Michael. the physicians try to save lives at any cost, and that is not good. And the physician said, well, but we are so uncertain, and I have to remember 1 of 10 cases where it went very well and the guy was saved, and the 9 out of 10 times where it did not function so that well, I try not to think about. Well, okay, I could say more about that, but that is the point is that to understand what you are a part of in the practice may be very useful for your attitude towards your practice. If you are not if you are not forced to think, oh, I'm not doing good. If you can say, well, maybe I can always do better, but this is difficult. And there is not, as we often think in our time, that if we have enough scientific knowledge, we should know what to do. I think in this pandemic time, it is also a topic that is not discussed, because very many people seem to think that you have a secure scientific knowledge about this virus and about the vaccines and all that. And if you come and say, no, in the empirical science, you never have a very certain knowledge about things. You are called, what do you call it? Also in German, you say, Corona-Leugner. What is that? Also you, what is that?
Deniers. Is that right? Who denied?
Yeah, you deny, and because you don't deny the virus, but you just point at the knowledge we have is not that secure, and and I think that is a big topic for philosophical practice, to understand how empirical knowledge is insecure. Okay, thank you. I stopped there.
Much, Anders, yeah? I don't know, Donato, you want to contribute on this question with something?
I try to do it very briefly. I'm not sure if the question was what kind of knowledge we produce within academic research on philosophical practice, or what kind of knowledge we produce within philosophical practice itself. I think the two questions are different, and I mean, academic research is still very dependent from this idea by Aristotle that science strives for universal knowledge, for a kind of objectivity, intersubjective validation, and so on. And probably if we do academic research on philosophical practice, we have to be oriented towards this idea, and this is something different from the knowledge you mentioned as wisdom, which seems to be very related to the individual, to the concrete individual being who is developing his or her personal growth. And the interesting point for me is that at the beginning, or for many years, or 100 years in philosophy, this was not really a tension. I mean, for example, the Platonic Academy, it was also the beginning of science, looking for universal abstract knowledge. And at the same time, Plato was the one who wrote the Socratic dialogues, where individuals were looking for developing their wisdom. So there was a kind of convergence or a unity between looking for universal knowledge and for knowledge about the universe and nature and so on, and trying to develop as a person, so striving for wisdom. And nowadays it seems that it has developed a kind of divergence, so that the individual are very concerned with their personal, private things, and don't have really the feeling that they are embedded in something more universal and general, and that the knowledge developed by theoretical inquirers is not very interesting for personal wisdom, and of course also the contrary. Theoretical inquirers, I mean, academic people seem to think that individual problems are not relevant at all for theoretical inquiries. Also in academic teaching, it's always a problem when a student comes and say, well, but my experience, and usually academic scholars say, well, that we are doing science here is not about your experience, so try to understand the theory and we are not interested in your experience. So a very good question could be, how should we see theoretical knowledge and wisdom, personal wisdom? How is a connection? And perhaps what you mentioned, Michael, this kind of action research, so reflecting about one's own practice and development of the practice in a way which is intersubjectively understandable and publishable in a paper, perhaps is a way to connect theoretical knowledge, academic research, and a kind of personal development as a practitioner or as a human being.
Thank you very much, Donata. I would like to use what you mentioned now with your last sentences in order to go over to the first questions that come from the audience. Namely, one of these questions is, to what extent do the panel members think that philosophical practitioners should get involved in research on philosophical practice? And the other question from another person from the audience is, what kind of approaches and methodologies is the philosophical practitioner or counselor, what is available to him or her that can be used for doing research? So to sum it up once again, is it important, and if yes, to which extent, that practitioners are getting involved in research, and what kind of methodologies and approaches are available for that? What do you think? Donata already mentioned now action research in terms of not problem solving, but more understanding. What are the others thinking about that?
I would. We have heard today that there are different methods and different approaches of research. And of course, not all approaches of research would be natural for every philosophical practitioner to go into. So that is a dependent. So I couldn't say one should do it. It depends upon the interest and what you want to do. But the way I am understanding philosophical practice, I would say it's very natural for me to take this step from practice to research, because the practice is a kind of research, as I have already mentioned. So, so that is, I think it is something that I feel I should really do, because I try to understand what I'm doing as a philosophical practitioner, and to try to find an answer on that question, I have to do some kind of research. I would also just mention that when we say that we want in research to have a general knowledge of things, and not the very individual personal knowledge, but the general kind of knowledge, I would say there are two types of general knowledge. So the one type is this generalizing knowledge, where you try to find out what is the case for some people. Is that the case for a whole population? Then you need a representative person from your population to be able to generalize to the whole population and all that. And so that is. But when you when I, for instance, I just to mention it again, when I talked to this lady from the hospital who was suffering from her practice, she then is telling her story, but that story isn't. It's possible to understand for all practitioners. She is not generalizing to a population of physicians, but she is telling a story that is relevant, that people can recognize the point of being part of such a practice. And that is also very important. That is not generalizing in this first sense, but that is, I used to call it universalizing. That is difficult to say in English, but it is not a general knowledge, but the universal knowledge that you get out of examples, out of stories, because they are relevant. You can recognize your own situation in them. And then you say, well, by me, it's not exactly the same, but it's something similar. That is universal knowledge. The concrete is universal.
Thank you very much. You pointed out these two forms of knowledge, general and universal knowledge. So we are back at knowledge, but Pepe, what is your idea? What do you think about whether practitioners should get involved in research, and if so, what approaches are available?
For me, philosophical practice should be philosophy, as Anders said, and I think that as Donata think. What do I mean? That if we are talking about methods in philosophical practice, we have think on methods in philosophy. I mean, a method could be archaeological. For example, I am thinking of Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault developed an archaeological method, and you can use that archaeological method, for example, to make a workshop. Second, Nietzsche talked about genealogical method. Why not to develop a workshop or a dynamic or an exercise inside the philosophical consultation with that point? Third, we have to talk about phenomenology, but not in general. I have seen some philosophical workshop that they said, now we have the phenomenological stage. And the people said, okay, let's go to make a description of this concept. For me, this is problematic. Why? Because the phenomenology is not about concepts, it's about eidos. Second, phenomenology is not just about to make a general description. Why? Because a general description could be made by people from psychology or from pedagogy or the like. But for me, for example, phenomenology is to develop an eidetic variation, a methodology that developed, for example, Husserl. And you can make a workshop on eidetic variation of eidos. And even I have written a book on that topic. I'm going to present it at the end of this conference. And I developed those methods of, for example, last one, wonder. Rachel Carson, a female philosopher, have a book that is The Sense of Wonder. And there you have a philosophical method. And for me, the philosophical method is take the real and serious methods in philosophy and put it in practice inside your consultation. This is because I agree with Anders when he said, for me to make philosophy, to make a philosophical consultation is to make philosophy, and I agree with him. And the second question, do we have to be involved in practice? Yes, of course, but the problem, there was another question that was, what is an academic criterion for good philosophical practice? The problem is that there are just a few faculty members that are philosophical practitioners. So I am very happy that Anders, Sergey, and this year, you, Michael, or Donata are inside the academy. Why? Because one, and I am going to finish, when we propose a project in Europe, I think that just there is one person who is working in philosophical practice now. And it is important that, for example, Donata or Jumaker were another evaluator of these projects. So in order to make it, you have to research inside the academia, you have to be an associate professor or full professor, and you have to be inside those places. And last one, it is important because we need professor that supervise. I am supervising PhD in Italy, in Brazil, in Argentina. Why? Because when a person wants to develop a PhD on philosophical practice, there isn't normally any professor that can help him or her to make research on philosophical practice. So please research in philosophical practice, and please try to be a professor or something like that inside philosophical practice, because it is very important for us. This is a reason because when I hear to Virtanen, Anu, and Pia, for me, it was very important to know how there are people that are researching with serious projects in philosophical practice.
Thank you very much, Pepe. I think that you brought up an important point here about the importance of philosophical practitioners inside academia. And in that respect, I have another question coming from the audience, and that is directed to Donata. And that is, Donata, do you include teaching on empirical research methods in your education program on philosophical practice? And if yes, then what is the content? If no, do you consider it possible or beneficial to offer future practitioners the tools to do research on philosophical practice?
Again, a lot of stuff. I start with the easy thing. No, in my program, we don't teach empirical research methods on philosophical practice. And I think that if one wants to work as a practitioner, it is not necessary to be able to do empirical research on philosophical practice. The question is, of course, also what does it mean, empirical research? I think that, of course, philosophical practitioners should be involved in research on philosophical practice, because they are the only ones that who really know what we are talking about. But then there will be, of course, a tension about the aim and about the method of research on philosophical practice. As I said before, the question is, okay, we want to do research on philosophical practice, but what exactly are we searching for? And this is open to many possible answers. And the second question is, of course, what is a method and with what criterion? And there is a problem I see here. I think that humanities in academia are very, very much influenced by the paradigm of natural sciences. So when you pose a question, okay, let's do research on philosophical practice in academia, you will probably be oriented towards, we want to find out how effective or how good the effect of philosophical practice are. But what is the measure for good? Then we have to find a criterion for improvement. I think you typically want to find out, does philosophical practice bring about any improvement? But what is improvement? And here you will have probably a tension, for example, with practitioners who say, well, it's not a matter of reaching an aim or improvement. Philosophical dialogue doesn't have to bring any psychological improvement or any educational improvement. It's just an open dialogue, and this has a value for itself. So, and then academic people would say, okay, but how are we, so what should we search for now, if it's so? Okay, it's dialogue without the constraint of reaching a task, without a measure for improvement. So what should we do research on? So then I find a good kind of middle way, perhaps a kind of approach you told us about, Michael. Perhaps it's a good approach not to pose questions too narrowed by the methods of empirical research in natural sciences, but just do some qualitative research and ask people involved in dialogue, okay, tell us about the experience, and then try to work on it. But I'm not sure that you will get much funding or legitimacy in academia if you are going to proceed like this. So it's not an easy thing. So.
Thank you very much, Donata. I think that you and also Pepe before you gave us already some ideas how philosophical practice can inform and also change research at the universities and on an academic level. It will, of course, be on us infiltrating academia to make the change happen. There was a last or a final question from the audience here, as far as I can see it. No, there are two questions. The first question is on research ethics. What do we mean and how do we deal with research ethics in philosophical practice? That was the first question. And the second question then was, what exactly differentiates research in philosophical practice? For instance, in positive psychology, they have projects that try to develop certain virtues on people's character, and they measure the effectiveness of that effort. Would philosophical practice research do anything different from psychologists in a case like that? So there are two questions, research ethics, and the other question is about what are the differences between research in philosophical practice and psychology. That's, I would say, the last round. Pepe, you already raised your hand, if I have seen that right. Just go ahead.
First of all, I have to say, Anders.
No, please, you started, so please go on.
Thank you very much. First of all, I have to say that in order to ask about research on ethics, we can ask, for example, to Lou Marinov. Some decades ago, he started to work on philosophical practice because he was working and researching in a center for ethics in Canada. Second, Birtanen Anu is working in how Socratic dialogues can be developed and can have some results in ethical issues today. So I think that it's important. And second, I think that we don't have to, in some occasion, differentiate or separate from other fields. I mean, when we get the research, the funding of the research for our project in philosophy in prisons, it wasn't just a project of philosophers. The supervisor, the director is me, that I am a philosopher. But the point is that normally today the research is it is not just made by one field, but it is made by several people from several fields. For example, in Boesio, we are working with psychologists, with people from pedagogy, with people from anthropology. So for me, it is important that we don't work in our ivory tower, because it is important that we are working with another people. So for me, this is important. And this could be a solution. Donata said that in some occasion to develop projects inside philosophy, it could be complicated. But the solution is that we don't have just to propose projects for philosophy. We can propose philosophical projects, and again, I stress this thing, philosophical projects for other fields, in order that since, and this is important, we are making a philosophical research. And this is what we are making, as I said, in prison, but and indeed, our project was the first project in all the fields in the CAL we asked for. And we have a second project, and we are developing philosophical workshops for volunteers and for NGO. And I think that this is important. It was it was funded by the Agency of Cooperation, and I think that this is important. We don't have to think in philosophical projects to research. We have to think in research, and if possible, to make philosophical projects. Even though we can include, for example, psychologists, pedagogists, people from pedagogy, and they can help us to open up to open our ideas. This is my proposal.
Yeah, very short to this question of research ethics. Also in empirical research, it's always a question if the research could have risks of any kind for those taking part in research projects. And that is very much then in empirical research what research ethics is about. So, those taking part in research should be informed about the risks and so on. But another thing is that if you do hermeneutical research of some kind, that is, you try to understand what's going on from experience. Such research will always have an ethical aspect, because when you wish to understand something, you want to understand it better. And that is an ethical aspect, and very often it should be more problematized. I think it should be more not just made to make a problem of it, but it should be more stressed, also more get more focus. And the second question. Sometimes I say when I do philosophical practice, I am not trying to change anything or to help anyone, or I'm just interested in the stories of the persons, and try to go into the stories and to share my participation in their stories, and that is of course helpful. It is helpful for people, as I said already, by this physician in the hospital, to understand, oh, so that's what I'm into, so that's what I'm doing. Yeah, okay, now I can see I'm suffering from it for good reasons. It is not so much something that is wrong with me. It's a problematic situation I'm into. I'm not quite sure if I have now really come to a conclusion, but I am sure that Michael will draw all the necessary conclusions of what we are saying.
I hope I can, but before I do that, I would like to give the word to Donato, or just ask you, Donato, whether you want to comment on these questions.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted shortly to say that before I said I don't think that practitioners necessarily need to be able to pursue empirical research on philosophical practice, but this doesn't mean they don't have to pursue any research on philosophical practice. Of course, it's important to pursue a kind of research on one's own practice. The point is what kind of research. And Pepe's projects and what he said before, I think this is very, very, very important, and the most successful projects I've ever heard about until now to gain legitimacy and attention for philosophical practice in the academic world. And in this world, it's very important to work interdisciplinary with other disciplines. But I see some risk in the fact that if you work with psychologists and pedagogists, then they could also infiltrate your project and impose their criteria, for example, how to define improvement, or that philosophical practice has to do with educational improvement at all. While, for example, Anders says, I don't want to improve anybody. I don't want to change people with philosophical practice. And we see already a tension. Or what is progress? In philosophy, it's getting more and more used, this kind of scale for moral development by Kohlberg. And there's a scale, so a measure of how developed a human being is morally. And they have already decided that, for example, if you think deontologically, you are more developed than if you think utilitaristic. And I would say, well, but the issue of philosophical inquiry is exactly to find out if it's really in this way. I don't know if it's really this way. So this is a risk. So I think that for practitioners, perhaps it's more interested a kind of research about reflecting and telling and reflecting about practice, discussing case studies. But this in turn brings, and I come to the ethical question, this brings ethical problems. When at the time in which practitioners wrote about case studies and tried to reflect on these case studies, they were confronted with this very big problem of privacy. You cannot really describe in detail what the issue was in a dialogue without revealing too much about the person with whom you have had this dialogue. But if you don't go into detail, then it's not very interesting. You miss a lot of this kind of experience in practice, and it's not available. It's not enough material available for others to reflect about it. So in this case, for example, I see a very big ethical problem. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that we have to prepare for landing now. It was a very interesting and informative discussion we had. Thank you very much for all your contributions. I think that one of the aspects that came more and more to the front was that it's not only research that can be relevant for philosophical practice and that supports what we're doing, it can also be the other way around. And that is philosophical practice and philosophy that can contribute and maybe even change research at university. And those of us who are working at universities, we know too good what research means, and there are very strict rules. We all need to publish a certain amount of papers in order to get publishing points. These articles have to be structured according to a certain structure, like the IMRAD structure and so on. Certain journals don't accept theoretical articles anymore, like a phenomenological investigation. They only want to have empirical articles on empirical projects. So here we can already see that the certain freedom that we once had in humanities, not only as philosophers, but generally as those being educated or working within one of the disciplines of humanities, that freedom is decreasing. And I think that what we heard now today is that there is still a great chance of doing something within humanities, within or with philosophical practice that is different, and that hopefully one day will get its deserved and necessary place inside academia. I would like to thank all you panel members, but also all of you in the audience. I hope you enjoyed this session. If you want to have our PowerPoints or slides, just contact us directly. Otherwise, I hope that all of you enjoyed it too. And I'm looking forward to see you at one of the other sessions at this conference. Thank you very much, especially to you, Regina, too, for supporting us all technically. Okay, thank you very much. Bye.
And thank you, Michael, for keeping this so professionally together.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you very much, all of you.